It was one of those rare weekends when my friends and I could escape from the usual chaos of our lives and venture into the wilderness. We had been planning this trip for months, hoping to find something interesting, something unusual. The locals had always whispered about old buildings hidden deep in the forest, places that time had seemingly forgotten. They weren't much for details, but their vague hints were enough to spark our curiosity. We set out to find one of these mysterious places. The hike was long and tiring, but we finally reached a secluded area covered by dense trees and thick underbrush. As we pushed our way through the thick foliage, one of my friends, Sam, stopped abruptly and pointed to something ahead. At first, I thought it was just another pile of fallen logs, but as we got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. We were standing in front of an old, decaying building, partially hidden by the overgrown forest. The structure seemed ancient, its crumbling walls and rusted metalwork giving it an eerie, forgotten vibe. It looked like a small outpost, maybe a radio station from another time. The broken antenna on the roof was a clear sign that the place had once been functional, but now it was abandoned. "Hey, check this out," Sam called out, drawing my attention to the slightly ajar door. We pushed it open with some effort, the hinges groaning in protest. A musty, stale air hit us immediately, and the darkness inside felt oppressive, as if the building had been waiting for someone to disturb its silence for years. The interior was even more haunting. Dust covered everything, and old equipment was scattered across tables and desks. There were machines that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, some with wires hanging loosely, others with dials that seemed permanently stuck in one place. One wall was adorned with a large map, cluttered with strange markings and faded symbols that made no sense to us. We exchanged glances, silently agreeing that this place, though abandoned, held a mystery that was begging to be unraveled. Our curiosity kicked in, and we began to poke around, careful not to disturb anything too much. Sam, always the techie, went straight for the equipment. "Let's see if any of this stuff still works," he muttered, examining the old radio equipment. I watched him as he carefully flipped switches and turned knobs. I wasn't expecting much. This place had clearly been out of commission for years, and even if there was power, who knew how long the equipment had been idle? But then something strange happened. Sam, fiddling with a dusty radio receiver, suddenly froze. "Wait a minute, guys," he said, his voice tinged with confusion. "Listen to this." We gathered around, expecting to hear the usual static of a broken machine, but instead, a soft crackling sound filled the air. At first, it was just random noises, the usual static and faint bursts of radio interference. But then there was something else. A low, distant murmur, almost like a whisper, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably something that felt out of place. Sam adjusted the knobs a bit more, trying to clear the signal, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. I think it's saying something." We all listened in, our eyes wide with disbelief. The whisper continued, faint but discernible, like an old recording stuck in an endless loop. But then, through the static, I swore I heard something more. It sounded like a name, or maybe a command. Is that my name?" Mark, one of our other friends, asked in a hushed voice, his face pale. A chill ran down my spine. There was no way it could be. We had just found this place, and there was no way anyone here could know our names. But the voice was unmistakable. It sounded as though it was calling to Mark. We all stood there, frozen in shock, trying to rationalize what was happening. Was this just a fluke, some coincidence? A faulty tape loop, or an old transmission picking up stray signals from somewhere? But none of us could shake the eerie feeling creeping up our spines. It was too strange, too specific. "What do we do?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper now. We all exchanged uncertain looks, the unease in the room growing palpable. "We stay and listen," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. Maybe we'll hear more. None of us were sure why we decided to stay, but we did. As we sat in that dusty, dimly lit room, listening to the whispers, the world outside seemed to disappear. The trees outside swayed gently in the wind, but everything felt distant, disconnected. It was as though we had crossed some kind of line. We sat in the dim room, the air heavy with dust and silence. The whisper on the radio continued, its indecipherable words filtering through the static. It was as if the radio itself was trying to communicate, but what exactly it was saying, none of us could tell. After a long, uncomfortable pause, Sam moved closer to the equipment, still mesmerized by the faint voice. He twisted the dials again, adjusting the frequencies. The faint crackling grew louder, and then it cut out completely. For a brief moment, the radio was silent, as if it had given up trying to convey its message. Maybe it's broken, I said, trying to sound more casual than I felt. My eyes scanned the room, resting on the various pieces of ancient equipment strewn about. The map on the wall caught my attention again, its strange markings giving off an unsettling vibe. It looked like something from a forgotten time, a map of routes that didn't seem to make sense. No, just give it a second, Sam said, his voice a little more frantic now. There's something here. I'm sure of it. He fiddled with the radio once more, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the antenna. For a few moments, nothing but static filled the room. But then, as if to mock our impatience, a new noise emerged, a deeper, more rhythmic hum that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't static. It was different. And then, unmistakably, the voice returned. Who are you? The words were low, distorted, but clear enough that I couldn't ignore them. My heart skipped a beat. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a direct question, as if the radio was speaking directly to us. What the hell is that? Mark asked, his face pale and his voice tight with fear. I had no answer. The voice didn't sound like a human voice at all. It was cold, distant, and somehow unnatural. Sam adjusted the dials again, desperate to clear up the signal. But the more he twisted the knobs, the clearer the voice became. It's repeating something, he said, his voice growing more unnerved by the second. It's saying, leave now. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The voice sounded too real, too urgent. There was no mistaking it. We weren't just hearing a malfunctioning radio station. We were hearing a warning. But why? Suddenly, I became aware of the eerie stillness in the room, the absence of the usual forest sounds that had been so present when we first arrived. Outside, the wind had died down completely. The usual chirping of birds was gone, and in its place, a suffocating silence seemed to engulf us. Guys, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I think we should listen to it. Mark, who had been standing by the doorway, gave me a nervous glance. Listen to what? This is messed up. We need to leave. Right now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something we had to understand. We had come this far, and now we were faced with something that demanded attention. Something strange was happening, and I wasn't ready to walk away without answers. Sam, however, wasn't so sure. He stepped back from the radio, his hand hovering over the equipment, torn between curiosity and the growing fear in the air. Maybe it's just an old broadcast. Could be some kind of weird station left over from decades ago, he said, his voice faltering. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was no longer certain, and neither was I. The voice continued to repeat itself, its words indistinguishable, but somehow insistent. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a twig snapping outside the building, followed by the faint sound of rustling. We all froze. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yeah, Sam said, his eyes wide with panic. That came from outside. Mark was already moving toward the door, his face flushed with fear. I'm not sticking around to find out. I don't care what's going on here. We need to leave. He yanked the door open and stepped outside. His footsteps hurried on the gravel path. The rest of us followed, unsure what to expect. As soon as I stepped out into the open, a wave of cold air hit me. It wasn't just the typical chill of the forest. No, this was something different. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the trees, which had once seemed vibrant and alive, now looked dark and foreboding. We stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of everything, when Sam's voice broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" he asked again, his eyes darting nervously toward the trees. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the wind. Nothing unusual. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling the tension rising in my chest. "I swear I heard." "I don't know, something moving," Sam said, his voice cracking. "Behind the building. It's like something's watching us." We all turned toward the radio station, the structure looming behind us like a dark, lifeless sentinel. But as we looked back, the radio had fallen silent once more. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the voice was still there, lingering somewhere, even if we couldn't hear it. Something had changed inside that building, something we hadn't fully understood yet. The radio had warned us, but was it too late to leave? I glanced at Mark, who was already several steps ahead of us, eager to distance himself from the place. He didn't seem to notice, but Sam and I exchanged a long look, both of us sensing that we had stumbled onto something much bigger than we had originally thought. Reluctantly, we followed Mark, stepping cautiously away from the building, but I couldn't help but feel that the radio, the whispers, and the eerie silence were all trying to tell us something. And I was starting to believe it wasn't something we could simply walk away from. Night fell swiftly, like a heavy curtain descending over the forest. The once bright sky turned a murky gray, and the moon, hidden behind thick clouds, offered little light to guide our way. We had set up camp not too far from the abandoned station, as we had planned earlier, but now, the quiet of the woods felt suffocating. A strange tension hung in the air, thick and oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I lay awake in my tent, staring up at the canvas roof, my mind racing. The shadows of the trees, illuminated faintly by the dying light of the campfire, shifted in the wind. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a branch, seemed to echo louder than it should have. The events of the day, especially the voice on the radio, kept replaying in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something we couldn't see, but that was somehow always there, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. It was strange. The forest usually felt like home, an escape, a place where I could disconnect. But now, every twig breaking in the distance, every creak of the trees, seemed to speak to something darker. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was the radio, too. That whisper. It was still fresh in my mind. I turned onto my side, trying to force myself to sleep, but something about the stillness made it impossible. I could hear Sam and Mark moving around in their tents, but it wasn't the usual sounds of friends settling in for the night. No, this was different. Every movement was quick, sharp, and punctuated with long silences, as if each of us were afraid to make a sound louder than necessary. Then, a sound cut through the quiet, soft at first, but steadily growing louder. It was a static crackle, a low hum. I froze, holding my breath. The radio. It wasn't possible. It had gone silent, hadn't it? There was no way it could be transmitting again. We had left it behind in the station, and none of us had been near it since we walked out hours ago. Yet, the sound continued, just outside my tent, faint but unmistakable. "Guys," I whispered, my voice tight. "Can you hear that?" There was a pause, followed by the rustle of Sam's tent zipper as it was pulled open. "Yeah," he said, his voice just as uneasy as mine. "It's coming from the station." Mark didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You sure? It could be something else, right? Like an animal or something." I didn't believe him. The hum was too consistent, too deliberate. It was the same sound we had heard in the station, faint, static, but with something almost alive about it. I pulled myself out of my sleeping bag and stepped out of the tent, careful not to make too much noise. The night air was cold against my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside the tents. As I straightened up, I saw Sam standing beside me, his face pale and drawn. "Let's check it out," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "Maybe there's something we missed." The three of us gathered around the campfire for a moment, each of us exchanging tense glances. We didn't speak, but the silent agreement was clear. We were going back to the radio station. It wasn't far to the station, but every step felt like it took longer than it should have. The night seemed thicker, as though the darkness itself had become denser, more suffocating. Each rustle in the underbrush made me jump, my eyes darting back and forth in search of whatever might be hiding in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the clearing where the station stood, its dark shape looming against the backdrop of trees. But when we reached the building, something was different. The door, which we had left ajar when we first left, was now closed tightly. The building seemed more solid, more real than it had before. It was as if it had become a part of the forest, blending into the darkness, like it had always been there. "What the hell?" Mark muttered. "We didn't close that door." I didn't respond. I was too busy listening. The hum, that eerie static, was louder now, unmistakable. It was coming from inside the station. "We need to go in," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. Sam was the first to approach the door. He pushed it gently, and to our surprise, it opened with barely a sound, as if it hadn't been shut at all. Inside, the radio equipment sat just as we had left it. The same dusty tables, the same old machines. But now, the room felt different. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and metal, but there was something else in the atmosphere. Something electric, something charged. The radio, sitting on one of the tables, was alive. The dial was spinning slowly, as if it were adjusting itself. The static had intensified, and now, as we stood there in the doorway, the faint sound of voices could be heard. "Don't." A voice crackled from the speakers. It was faint, distorted, but the words were clear enough. "Don't stay." The room went deathly silent. The three of us stood frozen, each of us processing what we had just heard. My skin prickled with an icy chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The voice was unmistakable now. It was telling us to leave, just like the voice had on the radio earlier. But this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was a warning. We exchanged glances, all of us knowing what we had to do, but none of us moved. We were caught between fear and the need to understand, to know what was happening here. And as we stood there waiting for something to happen, the room grew colder, the static more intense. The lights flickered on the radio, then died completely. And for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, without warning, the soft tick-tock of a clock began to echo through the building. It was loud, as if a clock had been placed right next to us, ticking away in the darkness. But there was no clock. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my stomach sinking. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the building, in the heart of the station. The ticking continued, louder now, almost as if it were mocking us. And in the silence that followed, I realized something terrible. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was counting down. The ticking sound was deafening now. It wasn't just one clock anymore. It was a chorus of them, scattered around the building, echoing through the walls, each tick seeming to grow louder and faster. The walls felt like they were closing in, the sound bouncing off them with relentless precision. My head was spinning. The air felt thick and suffocating, as if the building was drawing us in, pulling us deeper into its strange, twisted web. I turned to Sam and Mark, but neither of them spoke. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. We all stood frozen for a moment, caught in the oppressive silence that followed the cacophony of clock ticks. It felt as if time itself was warping, shifting into something unnatural. The radio, now completely silent, sat in the middle of the room as though mocking our hesitation. The walls felt alive, vibrating with the energy of something we couldn't see. The lights flickered again, and for a brief second, I thought I saw someone move across the far side of the room. A shadow, long and twisted, slinking just out of view. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the vision, but it lingered, pressing against the edges of my mind. And then, just as I was about to speak, the voice came again. This time it was clear, no distortion, no static. "Leave. Now." The voice was low, calm, but there was an undeniable force to it. It seemed to reverberate in my chest, like it was coming from within me. I swallowed hard, trying to fight back the growing sense of panic that was tightening around my throat. "Did you hear that?" Mark's voice cracked, his hand shaking as he pointed towards the radio. "It's not the same as before. It's different now." Sam nodded, his face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "That wasn't just static. That was someone talking to us." I glanced at the radio, but it was now completely still, as though nothing had ever happened. The lights flickered again, and the room seemed to darken, as if the building itself was taking a breath. "We need to get out," I said, my voice shaking. The words felt hollow in the tense silence, but I knew they were true. We had overstayed our welcome. Whatever was here, whatever was causing this, it wasn't something we should be messing with. But then, the voice came again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. "You won't leave, not until it's done?" I froze. My blood ran cold as the words sank in. "What does that mean?" I whispered, barely audible even to myself. "Leave, now," the voice repeated, more forceful this time, and the ticking of the clocks seemed to speed up, the sound warping, distorting, echoing in ways that made my head hurt. "We can't stay here," Sam said, his voice trembling. "We need to leave right now." But something stopped us. Something about the way the voice echoed in the room felt familiar, as if it had always been here waiting for us. I felt a chill run down my spine as I turned, looking around the room. The darkness seemed deeper now, more oppressive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone was watching us. And then I heard it again. This time, it was right behind me, so close I could feel the breath on my neck. "Don't you remember?" I whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The only thing in the room was the silent radio and the ticking of the clocks, still louder now, filling the space with their constant rhythm. "What the hell is happening?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Sam and Mark were staring at me now, their faces ghostly pale, their eyes wide with terror. "We need to go. Now," Sam repeated, but it wasn't the urgency in his voice that grabbed me. It was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. The air was thick, stifling, and I felt like I was suffocating. Every breath I took felt heavier than the last, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. "We're not alone," I muttered almost to myself. Mark looked at me, confusion on his face. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, my voice low. "But I think something is inside this station. Something that doesn't want us to leave." Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again, and the lights flickered once more. I couldn't help but flinch as the voice spoke once more, and this time, it felt like it was coming from the very walls themselves. "Don't go," the voice said softly. "Stay. You will understand soon." A sudden, sharp pain pierced my skull, as though someone had driven an ice-cold needle into my brain. I gasped and stumbled backward, my hands pressed to my temples. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me. The pain intensified, and I could hear the voice again, clearer than before, almost as if it was inside my mind. "You've been here before," it whispered. "This station is your home now." I staggered back, unable to stop myself. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that felt wrong, unnatural. I needed to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. The darkness was closing in on me, swallowing me whole. Suddenly, everything went silent. The ticking stopped. The voice stopped. Even the radio went dead. I was left standing in the center of the room, feeling like I was drowning in a silence so profound it was deafening. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog from my mind. But before I could make sense of anything, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, methodical. I turned, my heart racing in my chest, but there was no one there. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We need to leave." But I knew deep down it was already too late. We had decided, or rather been forced, to leave. But as I stepped outside the decrepit building, I felt a strange hesitation, as though the very air around me was trying to pull me back inside. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, were replaced by an eerie silence, so thick it seemed to choke the very life out of the place. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. I could hear Mark and Sam whispering behind me, but their voices seemed distant, muffled, as if they were underwater. The trees stretched up around us like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the sky, and I couldn't help but wonder how much of this was real. Had we imagined all of it? Or was something far more sinister at play here? We made our way back to the small camp we'd set up, but sleep eluded us. The thoughts of the station and the voice, those chilling words that seemed to echo in my mind, kept us awake long into the night. I kept staring at the darkness, wondering if we were being watched. There was something unsettling about the forest, now something wrong, and the idea of returning to that cursed place seemed almost too dangerous to even consider. When morning finally came, we broke camp quickly, eager to put distance between us and that abandoned station. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing, something we had overlooked. And as we packed up our gear, I found myself drawn to the photos I had taken of the station the day before. I pulled my phone out of my bag, flipping through the pictures, trying to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw it. In one of the photos, a shot of the radio station's dark windows, there was something different. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and shadow, an illusion caused by the fading sun. But as I zoomed in, I realized that it wasn't the light. There, in the reflection of the window, was a figure, tall, thin, and unmistakably human. But we had been the only ones there. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, the figure's face hidden in shadow, its form blurred and indistinct. And then, suddenly, I knew whatever had been at the radio station wasn't something we had stumbled upon by accident. It had been waiting for us. With my heart pounding, I showed the photo to Mark and Sam. Their faces went pale as they stared at it, unable to speak. None of us could explain it. None of us could make sense of it. We returned to the town later that day, but as we passed the local pub, we saw an old man sitting outside, staring off into the distance. He looked familiar, one of the locals we'd met when we arrived. He seemed to recognize us, his eyes narrowing as we approached. "You kids," he said with a half grin. "I told you not to mess around out there." I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The radio station, it's gone. It's just trees now." The old man chuckled softly. "The station? There's never been any station out there. Never. Just trees, and ghosts and things that shouldn't be." I stared at him, my mind racing. But we were there. We saw it. The building, the radio, everything. The old man's smile faded, and for a moment he seemed almost sad. "I wouldn't go digging around in the past too much, son. Some things are better left forgotten." Before I could respond, he turned and shuffled off, disappearing into the shadows of the pub. His words echoed in my mind, and I suddenly felt as if I had been standing on the edge of something far larger than I could ever comprehend. A chill swept through me as I realized perhaps there was more to the station than just an abandoned building. Maybe there was something about it, something dark, that was never meant to be uncovered. A few months later, I found myself returning to that forest alone. The station had vanished, just as the old man had said. There was nothing left but trees. No broken building. No radio tower. No sign of any structure at all. Just endless, silent woods. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked through the forest, trying to piece together what had happened. I retraced every step, but it was as if the forest had erased every trace of that place. No footprints, no debris, no sign of the station's existence. It was as though it had been wiped from the world entirely. I finally gave up and walked back into town, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The woods behind me felt endless, as though they were somehow part of me now. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, that whatever had been there, whatever had whispered to us, wasn't done with me yet. When I spoke to the locals again, the old man who had warned me about the station was gone, and no one seemed to remember him. When I asked about the radio station, they only stared at me with vacant eyes. Radio station? What radio station? And so, I was left with nothing but my memories, and the unsettling sense that some places, some things are never truly gone. They just wait. And when they're ready, they'll find you again,